Helena Blavatsky died in 1891, taking to her grave the most explosive secret she ever discovered about human nature. For decades, this knowledge remained buried in the secret archives of the Theosophical Society, accessible only to a restricted circle of initiates. Today, for the first time, this revelation will be completely exposed. What Blavatsky discovered goes against everything you learned about spirituality, psychology, and even about who you really are. She proved that within each human being exist four completely distinct entities, each with its own agenda, personality, and way of controlling your reality. And they are in constant war. These four forces are not metaphors or abstract concepts. They are real centers of power that Blavatsky called sacred thrones: the body, the ego, the spirit, and the soul. Each throne possesses unique characteristics, operates on different frequencies, and competes for dominance over your life experience. During her 60 years of occult research, Blavatsky mapped exactly how these thrones function, why they come into conflict, and how they can be harmonized. She discovered that most people live an entire lifetime without even suspecting they are governed by this complex internal hierarchy. Even more disturbing, she revealed that one of the thrones frequently hijacks the others, creating an illusion so convincing that the person believes they are following their deepest truth, when in reality they are being manipulated by a force they don't even recognize. Blavatsky's secret manuscripts describe with surgical precision how to identify which throne is in command at each moment of your life, how to recognize when the ego is disguised as the soul, how to perceive when the spirit is burning faster than your structure can support, how to distinguish the authentic voice of the soul from the perfect imitation created by the other thrones. For decades, only members of the esoteric elite had access to this information. Spiritual leaders, psychologists, and high-level therapists applied these principles in secrecy, obtaining results that seemed miraculous to outside observers. Now you will have access to the complete system. You'll discover not only how to identify each of the four thrones, but how they interact with each other, what specific conflicts they create in your daily life, and how you can become the conductor of this internal orchestra instead of being dominated by it. Prepare to discover that everything you thought about self-knowledge was only scratching the surface. The next few minutes will reveal the hidden architecture of your own consciousness, and why understanding this structure is the key to a transformation that goes beyond any personal growth you've ever experienced. The first center of power that Blavatsky identified is the body, but don't be fooled into thinking it's just flesh and bones. The body is the sacred field where your karma manifests and where your spiritual lessons take physical form. It's through the body that your soul experiences the density of matter and learns through the contrast between pleasure and pain, tension and relaxation. Have you ever noticed how your body sometimes reacts to situations before your mind even processes what's happening? How it contracts in the presence of certain people or expands in certain environments? This happens because the body is much more intelligent than our materialistic culture teaches us. It is a sophisticated receiver of subtle energies and ancestral memories. Imagine Maria, a 35-year-old woman who always felt a tightness in her chest every time she needed to speak in public. She couldn't understand why this happened, since she rationally knew there was no real danger. When she discovered Blavatsky's teachings about the body as a karmic field, she understood that her body was carrying a memory from past lives where expressing her truth had been dangerous. The chest tightness was ancient wisdom protecting her, even when it was no longer necessary. The body functions through impulses, repetitions, and instincts. It is always trying to keep you alive and safe, but it's also constantly processing energetic information that your conscious mind doesn't even perceive. When you honor your body without being enslaved by it, when you listen to its signals without completely identifying with its reactions, you allow this first throne to fulfill its sacred function. The key is in observing the body without getting lost in it. It should be respected as the temple it is, but it shouldn't be confused with your true identity. When you can maintain this perspective, the body becomes a powerful ally in your spiritual journey. Comment from which city you're watching, so we can know how far this ancestral wisdom of Blavatsky is reaching and touching hearts that need this understanding. But the body is only the first of the four thrones, and wait until you discover how the second throne, the ego, has been completely misinterpreted by almost all modern spiritual teachings. The second center of power revealed by Blavatsky is perhaps the most misunderstood of all, the ego. Most modern spiritual teachings treat the ego as an enemy to be destroyed, but Blavatsky discovered a much deeper and more revolutionary truth. The ego is not your enemy. It is the sacred guardian of your individuality. Without the ego, you wouldn't be you. You would just be an amorphous mass of consciousness without boundaries, without personality, without the ability to have unique experiences. The ego is what draws the lines that separate you from the rest of the world, allowing you to say, I am me and you are you. This separation is not a dangerous illusion. It's a necessary separation that allows universal consciousness to experience itself through billions of different perspectives. Think of Carlos, a man who spent years trying to kill his ego through extreme spiritual practices. He meditated for hours, avoided any form of vanity or personal ambition, and constantly criticized himself when he felt any individual impulse. The result was that he became an apathetic person, without direction, and curiously more egocentric than before, because he was constantly obsessed with monitoring and judging his own impulses. The ego is formed primarily through childhood experiences, emotional patterns, and social conditioning. It builds stories about who you are, what you deserve, what is safe and what is dangerous. These stories shape your reactions, your choices, and even your beliefs about the divine. The ego is like a pair of glasses through which you see the world. When these glasses are scratched or distorted, you don't see clearly. But when they're clean and transparent, the ego becomes a servant of clarity, not an obstacle to it. The throne of the ego is located in the mind, especially in the parts responsible for comparison, memory, language, and identity formation. The danger arises when the ego believes it's the only throne that matters. When it disconnects from the soul and spirit, it begins to govern through fear and control. It clings to certainty, resists transformation, and denies anything that threatens its narratives. In this state, the ego becomes tyrannical. True spiritual growth doesn't kill the ego. It educates it. It brings the ego into alignment with the higher thrones. It teaches the ego to be a translator, not a dictator. When the ego learns its true function, it becomes a bridge between the divine and the human, between the eternal and the temporary. And now we come to the point where everything becomes even more fascinating, because the third throne I'm about to reveal is completely different from what you imagine. The third center of power identified by Blavatsky is the spirit, and this is where many people get completely confused. While the body gives form and the ego gives structure, the spirit gives movement. It's the sacred fire that drives your evolution, that breaks limits and pushes you forward constantly. You can think of spirit as God's breath within you. It enters at the moment of birth and exits at the moment of death. It's what animates you, what shines in your eyes when you're alive with purpose and passion. The spirit doesn't care about the past like the soul does. It's not interested in history or karma. The spirit wants one thing: liberation, transformation, evolution. That's why the spirit frequently pushes people to take risks, to leave comfort zones, to abandon structures that no longer serve their growth. The spirit acts through intuition, inspiration, spontaneous clarity, and sudden shifts in consciousness. When a person receives a vision, feels a wave of inner fire, or an inexplicable attraction to something meaningful, it's the spirit speaking. Marina had an apparently perfect life, stable job, comfortable relationship, predictable routine. But at 28, she began to feel a strange fire in her chest every time she saw a brush or paint. It made no logical sense. She had never painted in her life. But the spirit was calling. When she finally had the courage to follow these inexplicable impulses, she discovered she had extraordinary natural talent, and that art was her true mission on Earth. In ancient traditions, the spirit was known as the solar flame, a force that descended from the divine sun to awaken the human heart. But spirit alone can be dangerous if not balanced by the soul and ego. Spirit is fire, and fire consumes. If a person follows only their spirit without wisdom, they can become reckless, unstable, or even destructive. The ego must contain the spirit's fire without extinguishing it, and the soul must provide context and timing. Only then can the spirit act in harmony with destiny. In energetic anatomy, the spirit is often felt in the solar plexus and chest, where personal will meets higher purpose. When the spirit is blocked, people feel numb, stagnant, depressed. When it's awakened, they feel unstoppable, creative and clear. The goal is not to tame the spirit, but to listen to it, honor its messages, and direct its energy with wisdom. But prepare yourself, because the fourth throne I'm about to reveal now is the deepest and most mysterious of all, and it will explain why you sometimes feel like you know people you just met. The fourth and deepest center of power revealed by Blavatsky is the soul, and this is the most difficult throne to describe because it's beyond ordinary words. The soul is the part of you that existed before this life and will continue after this incarnation ends. It's not made of flesh, thoughts, or energy in the usual sense. It's made of eternal memory. The soul is the master architect of your evolution. It carries your unique signature, your sacred name, and your contract with existence. The soul remembers everything. It remembers who you were in other lives, the lessons you came to learn, and the energies you came to embody. It chooses your body, your family, your challenges, and your gifts with perfect precision. When you meet someone and feel like you've known them for an eternity, or when you arrive at a place that seems strangely familiar, it's your soul recognizing something beyond this life. The soul operates on a level that cannot be understood by the mind alone. It speaks through sensations, symbols, and moments of deep resonance. Robert always felt different. Since childhood, he had an inexplicable sadness and a wisdom that impressed adults. He dreamed of places he had never visited and knew things he had never learned. When he discovered Blavatsky's concepts about the soul as eternal memory, everything made sense. He was carrying experiences from multiple existences. The soul exists primarily in the causal body, which is above the astral and mental planes. It's rooted in divine intelligence, but uses a cloak of individuality. Your soul is like a note in creation's symphony, distinct but inseparable from the whole. Many spiritual seekers confuse the soul with emotion or common memory, but emotions can belong to the body or ego. The soul is not reactive, it's observational and guiding. It observes, waits, nudges subtly. It never shouts or forces. That's why many people miss its voice. In secret traditions, the soul was called the immortal mirror because it reflects both your personal history and divine essence at the same time. The soul only speaks when you become quiet enough to listen. Leave a like if you're recognizing your own soul through these words, because that's a sign that your eternal memory is awakening. But now we come to the most crucial part of everything: how these four thrones come into conflict within you and create the confusion you feel daily. Now we arrive at the point where everything becomes fascinating and at the same time disturbing. These four thrones almost never operate in harmony. In fact, most of the time they are in conflict. They argue, override each other, give contradictory impulses, and demand different forms of loyalty. The first and most devastating internal conflict happens when the ego hijacks the voice of the soul. This occurs when the ego, in its fear of losing control, begins to imitate the soul's tone. It says, "This is your purpose," when in reality it's just reinforcing its own narratives of superiority, security, or validation. You can recognize this when you feel spiritually certain but emotionally anxious or rigid. The ego always resists changes that threaten its role. So it invents reasons why you shouldn't leave a toxic job, why you should maintain a self-image of being good, or why you deserve more recognition. Fernanda was a therapist who sincerely believed she was following her soul's mission. She spoke beautifully about spiritual purpose and helping people, but secretly she felt a constant urgency to prove her worth, competed with other therapists, and got irritated when clients didn't follow her advice. What she thought was the soul's voice was actually her ego using spiritual language to validate her need for importance. These situations can seem noble or even enlightened, but they carry an energetic rigidity. The soul's voice is calm, expansive, and timeless. The ego's voice is urgent, defensive, or superior. In this dynamic, the person gets trapped in spiritual performance. They talk about growth but resist vulnerability. They seem wise but secretly feel empty. The soul doesn't compete. It withdraws. When the ego takes the throne, the soul retreats and waits. Only when the ego becomes humble through failure, sadness, or surrender does the soul return to speak. The key is learning to distinguish these voices. The soul is never in a hurry, never needs to prove anything. never compares. When you feel spiritual urgency or need for validation for your insights, you can be sure it's the disguised ego. And if you think this internal war is complex, wait until you discover the even more subtle conflict between spirit and soul. The second most subtle but critical internal conflict happens between spirit and soul. These two thrones are both divine, but operate at vastly different speeds. Spirit is fast, it burns, moves, acts. Soul is slow. It contemplates, remembers, and moves according to long arcs of destiny. When spirit becomes too dominant, it pushes for action before integration has happened. It wants to create, express, release, and ascend, even when the soul is still in the process of learning, healing, or preparing. This creates a tension that feels like urgency without clarity. Marcus felt a constant fire in his chest that pushed him to leave his corporate job and start a spiritual project. The pressure was so intense he could barely sleep. But every time he tried to plan something concrete, he felt total confusion. Spirit was burning faster than the soul's clock could sustain. He was being called for transformation, but it wasn't the right time yet. A person can feel a desperate need to act, speak, or transform, but doesn't know why or how. They can start projects and abandon them. They can seek illumination experiences, but feel lost afterward. This is spirit's fire burning faster than the soul's clock can sustain. Spirit must learn patience, and soul must be willing to give permission to spirit to act when the time is right. When these two align, the result is destiny manifesting through action. The person moves not just fast, but in the right direction at the right time. Life becomes a dance between eternal wisdom and immediate expression. You stop feeling like someone who's always late or always too early. You find the perfect timing where action and wisdom meet. But there's a third, even deeper and more hidden conflict that creates most of your internal suffering. The third and deepest internal conflict is the ego's fear of spirit. The ego thrives on predictability, security, and control. Spirit is unpredictable, wild, and governed by divine impulse. The ego knows that if spirit is fully awakened, many of its structures will collapse. This includes false identities, attachments, roles, and expectations. The ego fears spirit because spirit doesn't ask permission, doesn't negotiate, it moves, commands, initiates sacred disruption. That's why the ego often tries to suppress or sedate spirit by distracting the mind, numbing the body, or feeding constant doubt. The ego will say, "Who are you to speak this truth?" or "This is too risky." It will surround spirit's flame with walls of logic and social conditioning. But once spirit erupts, the ego has no choice but to surrender or suffer. This is often the moment of crisis in spiritual awakening. Everything familiar begins to crumble. The ego calls this collapse. The soul calls it breakthrough. In this moment, the ego must be retrained, not destroyed. It must be taught that spirit is not there to annihilate it, but to reassign it. Anna was at the peak of her career as a lawyer when she began to feel an irresistible call to work with abandoned children. Her ego went into total panic. It listed 1,000 logical reasons why this was impossible: the salary reduction, what people would think, the instability. But spirit wouldn't stop burning. Eventually, she had to choose between ego's security and spirit's truth. Share this video with someone who needs to understand this internal war, because most likely that person is suffering exactly from not knowing this battle is happening inside them. The ego becomes a translator, a protector of the new self instead of a jailer of the old one. This transition is fragile, but it's the most powerful turning point in the journey toward true sovereignty. And now comes the final revelation that will change your perspective forever. Before the final revelation, you need to know how to recognize when your ego is distorted and sabotaging your spiritual evolution. The ego becomes distorted not when it seeks protection, but when it refuses to evolve. Its job is to form and maintain your sense of identity, but when it becomes rigid, it begins to resist any experience that might challenge its control. You can recognize a distorted ego by how it responds to silence, criticism, and mystery. When a person becomes deeply uncomfortable in silence, when they compulsively check their phone, interrupt others, or fill every pause with noise, they're not just avoiding boredom. They're avoiding the collapse of ego identity. Silence is a mirror, and the ego fears mirrors. A healthy ego can rest in quietude without panic. a rigid ego becomes agitated and seeks distraction. Patricia couldn't stay 5 minutes alone without feeling terrible anxiety. She needed to always be listening to music, watching videos, or talking. She didn't realize she was fleeing from the encounter with her own soul. Another sign of distorted ego is the need to explain everything, especially emotions. If someone feels the need to constantly justify their reactions or narrate their feelings as a defense mechanism, it's often the ego's attempt to maintain control. The soul doesn't need to explain its emotions. It simply feels and flows. Finally, a very subtle sign is resentment toward mystery. If a person feels anxious or irritated when something cannot be defined, labeled, or categorized, it shows the ego is dominating. The soul thrives in mystery. The ego crumbles under it. When you learn to recognize these patterns in yourself, you gain the power of choice. You can observe when your ego is trying to maintain control through fear and gently redirect it to its true function of wise protection, not paranoid tyranny. But now comes the moment of revelation that will connect all the dots and show how you can finally orchestrate these four thrones in harmony. Helena Blavatsky's final revelation about the four thrones is that they were never meant to be at war. The internal conflict you feel is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that you are a complex and sophisticated being whose different aspects haven't yet learned to work together. When you recognize that you possess these four distinct centers of power, body, ego, spirit, and soul, and learn to honor each in its appropriate role, something magical happens. You stop feeling like a fragmented person, fighting against yourself, and begin to experience yourself as a conductor, leading an internal symphony. The body becomes your wise anchor in physical reality, processing energetic information and offering instinctive wisdom without dominating you with primitive impulses. The ego transforms into your skillful translator, maintaining your individuality and protecting your boundaries without becoming a paranoid tyrant. Spirit flows as your evolutionary fuel, driving growth and transformation in the soul's perfect timing, and the soul emerges as your eternal guide, offering deep perspective and direction based on multiple existences. Imagine what your life would be like if, instead of feeling this constant war within you, every important decision was made with the combined wisdom of the four thrones. Your body would offer information about safety and vitality. Your ego would contribute strategy and intelligent protection. Your spirit would provide courage and evolutionary direction. And your soul would bring eternal perspective and deep purpose. You who have come this far are not an ordinary person. You are someone whose four thrones are awakening simultaneously, creating an inner complexity that few people experience. This may seem like a burden, but it's actually an extraordinary gift. You are being prepared for a level of consciousness and capacity that few human beings achieve. If this knowledge resonated deeply with you, leave a like so that more people who need this understanding can find it. Comment which of the four thrones you feel is most active in your life right now, and share this video with someone you know is living this internal war, because together we can create a community of beings who understand the sacred complexity of the human experience. Subscribe to the channel for more revelations about the mysteries that Helena Blavatsky and other occult masters discovered about the true nature of reality. And remember, you are not divided or confused. You are magnificently complex, and this complexity is your superpower waiting to be orchestrated in divine harmony.